the Brussels Report podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Pieter Cleppe. I'm the editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport.eu, and I'm very happy to have as my guest Daniel Kral, who's a Slovak national, a former colleague of mine at the British think tank Open Europe. But now, for a long time already, he is an expert in European macroeconomics at Oxford Economics. And of course, he's speaking in his own personal name, not for his company. But if you ask me, he's one of the leading experts on Twitter X when it comes to the Eurozone. There's actually not so many, surprisingly, given how important it is, I would say. But Dan is certainly somebody you should follow. So welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me.
So let's maybe get into it. You were just quoted in the Financial Times on what you could say contraction in industry, deindustrialization, which is specifically in Germany an issue. And one of the things you're saying is that with construction reeling under high interest rates and services out of steam, we're looking at a shallow technical recession in the Eurozone. So, of course, also, I guess, the energy situation, specifically in Germany, plays a big role. So maybe could you develop that a little bit? Like, how serious is the situation?
Sure. So I think there are two things, or the way to think about it is you have a cyclical, you have a cycle, and clearly with the high interest rates, inflation, and people pulling back on spending, we're at the downside of the cycle. And then there's a longer-term structural issue, which things like deindustrialization may be like a secular trend in Germany. So on the near term, I think clearly what's happened, we've had an energy shock in Europe, and it looks like structurally the energy prices are going to stay higher. And this is having a big impact on the energy-intensive industries like chemicals, paper, and so on, where Germany has quite a large footprint in that. And we've been seeing the underperformance of the energy intensive sectors for ever since the inflation shock started and energy prices spiked. So nothing surprising there, and they haven't really bounced back. There's some like a structural level shift down. So that's key factor recently. Another one that we mentioned is more the cycle, that the demand is now weak. We've had a rotation of spending away from goods to services as economies reopened after the pandemic. And so that as goods consumption surged during the pandemic, the reverse has happened more recently as people sort of prefer to spend on travel. You had see these tourism booms in Southern Europe this summer, despite much higher prices. Then you also have a slightly more nerdy, but the inventory cycle. We've had during the pandemic, the famous supply shortages and of inputs and everything. And that's why companies actually reacted by stocking up a lot. So we've had this huge restocking going on. But now, for different reasons, such as the weak demand, but also the high rates, and you typically finance these inventories with short-term loans, for which the cost has gone up massively since the tightening. Basically, now companies are destocking. So when you're destocking, you're not producing new; you're just using up what you've already stocked up, and that's weighing on the intermediates output. So an early indication of the cycle turning would be this restocking cycle beginning in the intermediates and basically down the. Supplying higher up the value chain from these, but it will start with the intermediates, so it's something to watch. And then there may also be an element of outsourcing, where in Germany we've seen the decline in industrial production much larger than the economies in its supply chains, so dogging Eastern Europe, but also Netherlands or Belgium, where industry has fared slightly better. So there's that to me suggests that even though they all face the same headwinds, structural and cyclical, it seems like the German companies will tend to outsource, particularly to Eastern Europe, where, for example, there's big auto production, and right now Eastern Europe produces more cars of German brands than Germany itself.
Okay,
that's a trend that's set to accelerate, likely with the current cost trends.
Okay, and when it comes to the energy price, you say this is a permanent fixture. which seems correct to me. Unfortunately, like what if Germany would decide to reopen their nuclear plants, maybe build new ones. Of course, this is a long term thing. If you would have more domestic European fossil fuel extraction, gas, for example, North Sea oil, I do see some movement there in the UK and Denmark. I mean, would this be a major game changer for European industry, or is it a factor that people who are opposed to certain, let's say, climate change inspired energy experiments are exaggerating?
I don't necessarily think it will be a major game changer. It could help at the margin, but
Hmm.
for example, reopening the nuclear plants, even if though it doesn't really seem feasible politically. The reason is that the price formation on wholesale electricity markets is based on the most expensive technology, which will remain gas and coal. It's just that during periods of low demand, these may be pushed out of the merit order, and so price will be a lot cheaper because nuclear could fill the demands.
Hmm.
But during normal times, I think the price would still be set by gas and coal, the two most expensive technologies. So, uh, in this regard, over the longer term, we wouldn't see much of a difference. We do have very ambitious plans in Europe on decarbonization and getting rid of these fossils, particularly in the energy sector. Again, where that should theoretically help because the renewables have much lower operating costs, but then there's all these new issues around their intermittency and
Hmm.
battery storage and upgrading grids and so on, which require huge investments.
Permits.
And of course, and the planning and so on, which obviously the EU is looking into as well, but it's currently for the very long haul. Um, yeah, the reason why I think the energy prices will remain structurally higher is basically gas prices. We now have replaced Russian pipeline gas with global LNG,
Mm.
which needs to be sent liquefied, sent on a tanker, and then regasified again and get pushed into the pipeline network, which is a lot more expensive than just getting it all through a pipe directly from Russia. Um, so that's really why we see a sort of a level shift up. It's a one-off, but then also it puts the European industry at a competitive disadvantage in places like America, where there's abundance of shale, and the US is now the largest LNG exporter in the world. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to get through last winter or this one.
Yes.
But they have enough they have much cheaper energy prices. They don't have still don't have a national carbon price market like we have with the
Mm.
ETS. So it's a lot more cheaper to pollute, and also the energy input costs for firms are much lower there. In terms of expanding natural gas production in Europe, Romania is doubling down. It's now the largest gas producer in the EU
Hmm.
after the shutdown of Groningen in the Netherlands. But again, that's quite marginal, and the
Sure.
business case is simply not there when you add up all the environmental costs and all the permits and the direction of travel in Europe. I think nobody is going to redevelop gas fields or develop new ones, given the direction of travel with environmental
Sure.
and green policy.
Yeah, the political environment is definitely not conducive for that, to put it mildly. You're right, but what if that would change? If European politicians and the sort of, let's say, the consensus would change to, look, we're importing this American LNG, as you say, on a massive scale, but we do have shale opportunities in mainland Europe, Germany, for example. What if if the policy when it comes to that would change? Do you think that would result in European energy prices maybe after 10, 15 years coming down to the American level?
Well, in 10, 15 years, according to the plans, we're in 2040 by then, we should be no longer using basically any gas or coal. So, and these things, they have a very long payoff. Like you
Mm.
invest now, and it's a huge upfront cost to develop these fields, but then over the lifetime, you'll get your return. The fact that the Americans already have them up and running, uh, that means that it may still be cheaper from a purely commercial perspective just to keep importing the American one rather than invest in building our own ones, given that we expect within 15 years to be not needing it anyway. In any case, what should happen if these trends actually pan out, then the cost of natural gas should come down quite significantly, given that we will be increasingly replacing it with renewables or non-fossil fuel sources.
Hmm.
Whereas the supply it should basically there should be a supply glut at some point, given that Europe is such a large consumer, and in America as well, they are coming off fossils, even though at a slower pace. But so that should result, just by itself, based on the purely supply demand logic, that the prices in the longer term should come down.
And am I wrong to press you so much on energy? I mean, am I exaggerating, or are people exaggerating the importance of the energy price for competitiveness and economic growth?
Well, it's important, but it's just one of factors. If you think of the cost base of a company, then again, for the energy intensive industries, it will be a lot more important. For other industries, skills and access to people,
Mm.
and supportive regulation and all that may be a lot more important than the energy prices, where they can swallow a one-off level shift. So we're focusing a lot on the energy intensive, which also feeds into other, which means restructuring of supply chains, really,
Mm.
of the way firms operate now, especially in industry and these very fragmented chains of production. So you need to look for new suppliers and so on, which will have impact on employment and potentially balance of payments, because now we need to import it from America, whereas we used to produce it ourselves. Uh, but then again, on the grand macro scale, you it really is on the it's rather marginal impact. Uh, Obviously, this presents a policy dilemma. What do you do? Do you just subsidize things,
Mm.
so to bring energy prices down to maintain competitiveness, or you just go along with it that now we're in an environment of structurally higher energy prices and you let it happen, and you kind of wind down in a controlled manner the industries that will suffer, and you hope that something will come along and replace it.
and and when looking at, let's say, potential less energy intensive alternative industries, how is Europe doing? How is Europe doing when it comes to attracting talent? Maybe linked with, for example, developing AI, which according to some people is going to be the massive growth sector of the future.
Well, I guess if you're a young tech AI entrepreneur, Europe is not probably top of your mind, but the US is, in terms of where you're going to locate, because of its
Hmm.
history of innovation and spawning the tech giants of today. Uh, in terms of how Europe fares, I think we see this global subsidy war, if you will, in promoting domestic industries. Now, industrial policy is back in after a long time of being frowned upon. The Americans have got their Inflation Reduction Act and other policies, which are essentially huge subsidies for their domestic industry. China has been covertly and overtly subsidizing industry for a very long time, and now we're basically trying to catch up in Europe with the Green New Deal and various other, and also the pandemic funds, which are supposed to be spent on greening the economy, and so on. So that's in an ideal world, you would have production happening in places where it has the most, where it's the most competitive, but that's not the real world, and these subsidies skew the the the,
Yes.
the competing space, and that's why. Europe does not want to stay behind, because no politician wants to see the industry leave to much better subsidized region like the US, because they haven't done enough and are going to miss out on the technologies of the future.
Well, that's definitely how politicians think. Of course, in reality, we see the next generation EU money not exactly delivering more, innovation and top talent, are we? So what could Europe do to to attract more talent, or to, let's say, to try to convince more of its own talent to stay in Europe, to invest in Europe, to start companies here?
Well, I think regulation plays a part. The labor markets play a part. Overall, I feel like the direction of travel, though, is in the other direction, with the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment, and you've got elections in
Hmm.
Europe returning people who are promising to lower immigration. The fertility rates in Europe are simply too low. In some places, we already have declining labor force or only sustained thanks to the inflows of foreign-born nationals. And if we clamp down on that, then obviously a labor market and the inflow outflow of the labor force is a very important determinant of long-term growth. So if we clamp down on immigration and don't really replace it with higher domestic supply of labor, then or some sort of qualitative leap in the quality of human capital, I don't know, much more people doing STEM degrees and becoming entrepreneurs and developing. A big problem in Europe is also the funding ecosystem for young companies. It's very bank dominated. Banks are a lot more risk averse than your venture capitalists who will sprinkle their money across a number of companies, most of which will fail, but then that one will make their return. That makes it. In the US, there's a much more developed ecosystem for that. I mean, the level of funding in the US, just in one region of not even the Silicon Valley, will dwarf all of Europe together. So that's
And
another.
why, if I can ask, why is okay? I mean, it's obvious that it's not going to be possible for Europe to have, the size of the private equity market as the United States. But why are we doing so poorly when it comes to, I mean, we have a lot of wealthy people in Europe and wealthy families, and
That's true, but they tend to be more risk averse. And so they will invest their money more in your traditional 60-40 portfolios and
I see.
they're managed by professional wealth managers. Where in the US, there's a much more of a culture of risk taking by wealthy individuals and also pulling their money into venture capital funds, would then select companies to invest in.
Which is not I think, not an optimistic take, because if it were about regulation or anything else, then we could change it. If it's about the mentality of the people, then it's hard to change, I guess.
Of course, and I think if there was an easy solution, then we would have done it already. So economies on the macro scale just tend to bubble along their set, trajectories, and it's quite rare to see historically some sort of turnarounds where you have a shift up to a higher growth path or something. I mean, it is usually the structural forces that determine, like your demographics, your productivity growth, which also have their determinants, and a lot of it will be, set by how things are done in a country or region.
Well, maybe that brings us to a very important topic that I've been following for a long time, which is the Eurozone and whether it can survive. When the Eurozone was started, then there were many economists predicting it would not survive. I think it was in December 2009 or January 2010 that the European Commission came up with a paper making fun of these economists, basically publishing quotes of predictions that, according to the Commission, then turned out to be wrong. How the Eurozone was unsustainable and everything, but it didn't take long. I think 1 month later, Greece and the Prime Minister of Greece, Mr. Papandreou, if I'm not mistaken, he had to tell his European colleagues that his country was virtually bankrupt, which set in wave a massive Eurozone crisis that lasted, you could argue, until deep into 2015 in waves, with different countries coming into the spotlight. And since then, it's been calmed. But I think many people are asking themselves the question, like, how sustainable is the Eurozone if we have a continuous uptick in interest rates? Countries with high debt levels, Italy, of course, but also Belgium, maybe even France could come in the spotlight. Perhaps, at least that's the sort of the pessimistic take of some people. So yeah, what do you think about this?
Well, I think the Eurozone has changed a lot since the early years and the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, where it almost all fell apart. If you look at the institutional architecture underpinning it then compared to what we have now, and the transformation at the ECB, starting with the whatever it takes in the summer of 2012, which was really the turning point in the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, where basically ECB restated its unwavering commitment to the integrity of the euro, which was quite strange that it wasn't really there until then. And since then, we've had QE, we've had the pandemic purchase program, now we have the transmission protection instrument. These are all sort of implicit guarantees for investors that if countries get into trouble, they will not follow the path of the likes of Greece or Portugal or Ireland in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
That the ECB is ready to step in. The problem also at the time was that at the time of the sovereign debt crisis was that Germany was unwilling to step up and be this sort of unconditional lender or bailouter of last resort, as if to provide the public goods for the Eurozone, and was demanding these very harsh conditions in return for loans, which often made the debt to GDP dynamics worse, because when you're aggressively tightening in a cyclical position where your economy is on a downturn, then that will tend to exacerbate the downward spiral. And that's what happened in some countries. And again, it's hard to imagine that now, with the direction of travel of the higher demands on public spending and even the fiscal consolidations that we're looking at now after the pandemic, are going to be a lot more benign. We have much higher debts, but we have been funding them at much cheaper rates. So actually, government interest expenses or debt servicing costs are near record lows. They have risen relatively, not a lot, in the Eurozone. Some countries more than others. In Italy had about 10% of inflation-linked bonds. So they have shot up a bit more, but now that inflation is coming down, also their interest expenses are coming down. So overall, and the long-weighted maturities of about 8-9 years easily by countries means that the actual pass-through of the higher rates has been quite limited. Debt servicing costs have increased only marginally, and already now the ECB is done with hiking. We know that much, and now the attention has shifted into when is going to be the first rate cut and how aggressively are they going to cut afterwards. As to how fast will the easing cycle be? So I think from this point of view, we have kind of weathered the worst of the inflation and interest rate shock. Now the expectations have shifted. Just in the last month and a half, or roughly since the end of October, we've had a huge rally in fixed income markets in Europe. The Italian government bond yield for 10 years went down from over 5% to under 4%. That's a huge move in such a short space of time.
Mm-hmm.
Also, other periphery economies and also spreads with Germany remain at relatively sort of non-alarmist levels, normal levels.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, from that point of view, as if the trigger for the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis was public finances and the external shock that's basically shown us just how bad they were, and without the infrastructure to hold it together, we don't see we're not going to see a repeat of that. We're in a much better position. Plus, we have these support mechanisms in the form of the ECB, but also the EU the pandemic fund and the various transfers, also the regular structural funds which go to the weaker economies. So if you look at also the troublemakers or the problem countries at the time, if you look at Greece, now Greece is running primary surpluses. So if you exclude interest payments, its government is already running a primary surplus. Portugal is running a large surplus. Cyprus is running a surplus, even though they've only not so long ago during the pandemic ran these huge deficits. So they've turned around, they've consolidated finance.
Ireland.
And of course Ireland, but Ireland is a bit special.
Yeah, I know.
They've got the huge windfall from the multinationals.
But still, like to pick up because you said so much, and all very interesting. But like maybe the German recipe. I mean, I did not consider that that extreme, but that's, I guess, a relative assessment. But as you mentioned, it's a fact that these countries, have been able to outgrow a lot of their trouble, right?
Yes, so in this sense, we have a complete opposite of what happened after the global financial crisis happening now, where Germany is the underperformer, and we're wondering what to do about Germany, how to turn around
Yeah.
its growth model. And now the ones outperforming and beating everyone is Portugal, Greece, Spain not doing too bad, and the small East European economies and the Nordic economies, and Germany, the sort of the leader, the motor of Europe in the 2010s is now the laggard.
Also because Germany hasn't been, following its own policy prescriptions, you could argue.
Which would be what?
Well, to have balanced budgets, like especially in COVID, Germany went crazy with enormous guarantees. I know it's not exactly money spending, and then of course it's energy experiments. Maybe that's separate.
I don't necessarily think it's related to the fiscal situation. In fact, Germany could be doing better if they spent more or invested more in the good years when the real interest rates were deeply negative.
Mm.
And because it's Germany and it's the sort of the safe haven of Europe, they have the capacity to borrow more to sustain a higher debt level, especially if it's productive investment for which there will be returns in the future. Now, of course, there's the most recent budget drama in Germany and the
Yes,
court
yes.
forcing the government to basically cut down the deficit and eliminate all these off-budget funds,
Yeah,
of which Germany is a master.
which are gigantic. I think even if you count them all together, they're bigger than the regular budget. Am I
Correct.
am I am I right?
Yes, yes, it's hundreds of billions that you're
That
talking.
that is just incredible. I don't think that's the case in Greece. I may be wrong, but
No, no, and that's I guess that's the incentive
it's just
when you have these budget rules and there are
it's
things
puzzling.
that you include in the budget, but then there are things that you can borrow for, but you don't have to include in the official balance. And
Quite.
if you have the incentive to do it that way, then you will. But essentially, the German economy it's bigger than that. It's more than just the government not borrowing or borrowing too much. It's more to do with the structural
Sure.
headwinds for the industry, the demographic outlook, weak productivity growth that's been more longer running, and also the lack of a big China stimulus, which is something that pulled Germany out in the
Mm,
2010s,
sure.
and the auto industry boomed back then. Right now, we don't see anything of the sort. China has its own problems, and
Mm.
there's no big external source of demand coming that would save a large open economy and very export dependent like Germany.
But that does not create an environment, a political environment in Germany. If you look at the rise of the AfD, the rise also of the CDU again,
Mhm.
which has become, let's say, a more um, center-right party again, abandoning the more centrist, center-left
Mhm.
attitudes of Merkel. I mean, if there's a big crisis in the Eurozone, if politicians once again are faced with the question: do we need to, provide another emergency package? Um, Germany may be a more difficult partner. One, and secondly, we had Christine Lagarde. Remember her saying in the depths of the COVID crash, when COVID just started, that she stated, "We are not here to close spreads." I don't think that's something investors in bonds have already forgotten, have they?
Yes, but that lasted about a day and a half. She was relatively new in the role. It was the first major shock that she went through, and that's widely considered as a major gaffe that she put out there. The thing, so on the monetary policy side, I think investors are much more sanguine about the or the redenomination risks and countries leaving the eurozone, the ECB not stepping up. I think
Okay.
that risk has widely diminished because of through the actions and through the creation of all these programs that are there to be activated under some conditions. PEP was unconditional, but the TPI, there were some conditions for countries to meet, but again, much more lenient than, for example, the OMT, which followed the whatever it takes, where one of the conditions was to be in a ESM, IMF bailout program, which is absolutely toxic for the southern countries. And that's why also the TPI was created, because people know that these countries, even if worse came to worse, they're not going to apply for it because of the political backlash and
Mm.
how toxic it is home. On the fiscal side, the bar was always high for new borrowing and this kind of pandemic fund. We would need another extreme shock, and it's not just Germany; it's the Netherlands and it's the Nordic countries saying it, and they mean it. And also, I think it's also on the large recipients now to show that it was a good decision and that they make a success of it. It's a lot of money that some countries have been allocated in grants, so they don't have to pay back, or loans, which are discounted compared to their own borrowing, how much they borrow at. So if they can put the money into good use, and you can see a demonstrable difference, then they
We
will be.
can only hope, right?
Of course, but it's still quite early on. So the money run, I think it should accelerate. Most of the money is still not being used. It's still
Hmm.
sitting there. But that's a key thing as well for the future. And if it's judged as a successful program where the money was used up for good purposes and countries are doing better as a result, then going to have a much stronger. The perception will be very important.
Well, but even if all of it would be wasted, which I don't think, I only think some of it or most of it, but not all of it, will be wasted. Even then, they may continue because the what I see as the problem with this next generation EU, this RRF, basically European fund, is that it's not funded by payments into a budget coming from the member state. It's funded by the European Commission borrowing on the international markets, maybe getting some cash from China, and then providing this cash to the member states, after which the member states will have to pay it back in one way or another. Correct. Which I think they will be wary to do, and they will also be wary to allow the Commission to directly tax European citizens, meaning that in 5, 6, 7 years, I think there will be a deal to take out a new loan to pay back the old loan for NGEU, right? Meaning it's permanent.
That's certainly a scenario. Some people would argue that would be a good thing to have a permanent debt market at the EU supranational level, like the US has for the federal debt. We don't really have that at the EU level, and there would be demand for this, what would be considered a safe asset. In terms of the EU taxes, we already have EU taxes like the plastic tax, or discussions on the digital and financial transaction. We've got the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's also an EU tariff. That is all going to be paying for the NGU borrowing.
True. Well, maybe one more attempt to press you a bit on the sort of imminent collapse of the Eurozone, which I think we should never predict because, of course, you can never know. But if we are in a 1970s scenario with central banks very keen to hike a little bit, not too much, and then jump at the first opportunity back into, loosening. That's what happened in the 70s until they were so desperate that they had to appoint Volcker, Paul Volcker, a hawk, who fixed inflation in the United States by drastically increasing interest rates. People should realize he was appointed by Carter, a Democratic president, who was completely desperate because of the failures of the Fed before, because they were not tough enough. Now, I think it's impossible to predict, but if we are in a scenario like that, at least in Europe, that inflation comes back again and again and again, and in response, the ECB will have to restart hiking interest rates again and again. Is this a different scenario for everything you've mentioned for the Eurozone, for debt sustainability? It's very interesting that you say that debt servicing costs are at an all-time low, but maybe then that will no longer be the case?
I mean, my point was that debt servicing costs have bottomed out during COVID when interest rates were at their rock bottom, and they've only gone up marginally because of the longer weighted maturities. So the scenario you describe, my view is that a high inflation and high interest rate environment would be mutually offsetting for public debt because you measure debt as a share of GDP. So if you have high inflation and your GDP is being inflated as a result, that will be offsetting the rise in interest rates. So the more you need to spend on servicing that debt. But it would have very adverse consequences for living standards unless you get high wage growth or productivity boost at the same time, which is quite unlikely. So I think there the risk would be bigger in terms of a political backlash at the national level, rather than immediately affecting or adversely impacting that sustainability.
Okay. All right, good. Thanks, Dan, and always super interesting to hear your thoughts about this because you're one of the people I think that follows this extremely closely. Apart from, of course, the bond vigilantes that we sadly no longer have in Europe. Otherwise, some of the what I would call suboptimal spending policies would have been discontinued a long time ago. So but let's maybe go a little bit outside of the Eurozone. On Twitter, you've been highlighting Poland as one of the major growth poles. of Europe. Could you tell a little bit more about this? What is the reason that Poland is doing so well, and are there maybe other non-Eurozone economies that are really performing well?
So on the European level, you would expect countries like Poland or the emerging economies to be outgrowing the developed ones because they still have a gap to catch up with. It's sort of the convergence continues. Poland stands out in its post-pandemic performance, doing much better than the regional peers like Czech Republic or Slovakia or Hungary. And
Hmm.
one of the main ones is that the Polish economy is much more diversified. There isn't one leading industry. For example, in Czech and Slovakia, it's very auto sector dominated, which has struggled. Uh,
Hmm.
they're a lot more tied to the German supply chain than Poland. Again, a much bigger country. They're not as uh, in terms of their shares of trade and overall trade openness. They're not as dependent on Germany or on foreign trade. There's a big domestic market. Um, there's also been able much better to use up their allocated EU funds. So now they have the recovery fund money frozen. That's likely to be unfrozen now with the new government.
Hmm.
But from the old structural funds, they've been able to use up everything. Countries like Slovakia face losing a big chunk of it, about 30%, because they just haven't been able to put into projects. If you look at just the highway infrastructure in Poland, what it was 20 years ago to what it is now, the country has been covered in highways, which basically increases your infrastructure and connects companies and makes life a lot easier.
Hmm.
Economic activity. In countries around, they're struggling a lot more. Poland has also the advantage of being relatively flat.
Just a small interruption. I do remember a report by the European Court of Auditors specifically singling out Polish highway investment that was financed with EU money as problematic, according to the auditors at least. So I'm just saying maybe some of the GDP growth is actually not all that real,
Well,
but
I guess longer term, you're better off having it, even if it was built problematically and now connects the whole country,
true,
than not have
true,
it at all and just lose the money.
very
Uh,
true.
um, so Poland, and the other ones doing really well are like Romania, the Baltic states, which
Hmm.
again is something you would expect to see, and the EU first and foremost with the abolishing of the single market and the abolishing of trade barriers should act as this convergence machine where the weaker and the transfers from the stronger economies to the weaker ones. And that's really unfolding before our eyes. So that's not so surprising to see these catch-up economies doing better than the large West European ones.
Okay, and maybe actually also returning a little bit, like when you're talking about single market, I mean the response to the U.S. IRA, as you mentioned, the fact that all over the world you have more protectionism, more state entrepreneurism, which I would not call entrepreneurism, but anyway, like the government engaging in business. Showering subsidies for semiconductors, whatnot. What we see is that the EU is following the same path. Is trying to have its I think it's called European Sovereignty Fund or something. At least that's an idea of von der Leyen. That's not flying yet, but I'm afraid it's going to come in some way. But you also see that at least from my impression that governments are in the European Union are caring less and less about the single market rules. France, for example, is about to build a major subsidized battery center in the north of France, thereby stealing business from Belgium. So is this perhaps a tail risk, a problem in the future for European growth?
So I think the EU competition and single market has been disrupted majorly by COVID, when it was pretty much a free for all. Governments were allowed; these rules were
Mm,
suspended, and governments were able to bail out whoever they wanted, by however much they wanted, and that distorted the level playing field massively, because the bigger countries with bigger pockets like Germany could afford to do a lot more than other weaker ones. Now we're out of that emergency. The EU competition rules have kind of bounced back, and the Commission still needs to formally approve all these subsidy projects that you mentioned. At the same time, it feels like that the thinking has shifted that towards more accepting as a fact of life that we are going to see more state intervention and that poses risks for the integrity of the single market and for ability of countries to compete with one another on a fair basis, since some just have more firepower available. For example, if Germany caps energy prices for industrial consumers indefinitely, and so they will not have to face the market prices, but other countries cannot afford to do that, and that's allowed to go through, then that gives Germany a huge competitive advantage.
Okay, good. Then let's maybe go to the very last topic, which is Brexit. I mean, you're a resident of the United Kingdom. I've been working a lot on Brexit, and with my think tank Open Europe, we sort of predicted that, surprisingly, the prediction was that it's not going to matter all that much economically. The prediction was, look, this is not going to turn the UK into an enormous growth magnet. It's not going to destroy the UK economy entirely. It's going to be something in the middle, and whether it's going to be slightly better for Britain or slightly worse is going to largely depend of the United Kingdom exploiting the newly acquired freedoms as a result from Brexit. So what do you think? Has this prediction been more or less accurate, or what can we conclude now, a few years down the line?
I would say it's relatively safe prediction to have made. The problem we've had is that we've had the pandemic, the inflation shock, now the interest rate shock, and Brexit on top. So it's hard to disentangle the impacts of one from the other. On the purely theoretical and practical level, if you erect trade barriers with your largest trading partner, then that should lead to some loss of welfare, a loss of activity. On this basis, Brexit should be a minor drag, unless that is offset by growth somewhere else, growth with trade with other regions or domestic productivity growth, which at this stage has not really materialized. As you said, the UK has now opportunity to do things differently. I'm not quite sure that the people in charge want to actually know what they want to do with this freedom, that there was ever a grand idea that this is how we're going
Quite.
to do things differently. So the potential is there. I don't think that has been grasped yet. And I think the direction of travel generally in the UK is to be seeking ways how to get closer to the EU without actually uh, uh, entering the single market and customs union again. I think during the Brexit negotiations, the Luxembourg prime minister noted that the UK has traditionally been in with a lot of opt-outs, and now they're out and they want a lot of opt-ins. I think that's kind of summarizes it. On the macro level, the UK economy has done better since COVID than France or Germany. Again, maybe it could have done even better if it was in the EU and without the new trade barriers.
Yes.
Who knows? But
Yes.
it's certainly not some sort of disaster and a collapse that many have predicted.
I agree, and of course, it's true that this new bureaucracy is terrible, and is definitely a cost not only for the UK but also for the Europeans. I found the recent quote of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, very interesting. He basically, right after there was a deal at the EU level on an regulation of artificial intelligence. Never mind that there's not so much AI business in Europe; they want to regulate it. So he basically said, well, first of all, he said it's not so intelligent to regulate an industry when you don't really have much of an industry of that kind. And secondly, he mentioned explicitly the United Kingdom. He said they are not going to have an AI act, or not the same one. So perhaps indeed the divergence, the Singapore on Thames, as it was once professed, will not come about from British politicians slashing all kinds of EU regulations, but simply as a result of the UK sitting passive when the EU comes up with ever more innovation hostile regulations.
To an extent, I think the sector that you mentioned, AI, is very niche at this stage. It has basically no impact on the macroeconomy. It's a lot about the long term and adoption of these technologies in our everyday lives and maybe boosting productivity as a result. I think if you look at the main industry associations and business associations in the UK, for practical reasons, actually advocate alignment with EU rules because the UK is too small to do its own thing. You've got the big blocks like the US, EU, and China, and they are the rule setters. And then you have the sort of relatively smaller economies on the margins who are rule takers. And that is the case across the traditional industries and businesses. And so for purely practical reasons, so there's no two sets of rules to follow for UK companies. It's just easier, makes everyone's life easier to just align, which again, UK was acted often as a brake on the ambitions and centralizing tendencies and over-regulation in Brussels, but now it doesn't have that voice. So it may end up with the worst of both worlds, that the regulation coming out of Brussels and having no say over it, and the businesses for making their lives easier, even though it's suboptimal, still have to adopt it and live with it.
Daniel Kral, thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter.
The Brussels Report podcast.